As I've said countless times on this channel, the 1930s was an era when a whole host of new technologies came to fruition in aeronautics, and this helps explain the sheer number of aircraft and concepts produced in that decade. Of course, many of these proved to be dead ends, but even for those designers and companies that correctly predicted how future aircraft would be, success was not guaranteed. And today's aircraft, the Rogožarski IKZ, is a great example of an aircraft that seems to have got everything right, but didn't get the opportunity to really make an impact because of timing and circumstance. And if you weren't aware already, be warned, I will be butchering a whole bunch of Yugoslavian names today. But to return to the IKZ, it is a shame that it doesn't get the recognition it deserves, because it appears to have been a very capable aircraft, and had it been created sooner, might have played a more important role and be better known as a result. The background to this fighter lies in a program implemented by the new Kingdom of Yugoslavia, only created in 1918 in the aftermath of the First World War, to build up their national aeronautic industry. This saw promising students and Air Force officers sent to foreign nations, principally France, to get advanced educations on the latest developments in aircraft design and production. And this program showed great potential payoff when two of the designers who participated, Ljubomir Ilić and Kosta Sivchev, designed a new fighter for the Yugoslavian Air Force, essentially completely independently from the official aircraft industry. Naturally, working on this as essentially a hobby project meant that development was slow, but in 1933 their ideas and scale models, which had even wind tested in Paris, got enough official interest to get built by the Yugoslavian Icarus aircraft company. This was the Icarus IK-1 prototype and ultimately the IK-2 fighter, which first flew in 1935. But while the IK-2 was by the standards of the day a reasonable aircraft, its designers had with great foresight recognised that the future of fighters was shifting rapidly and were working on an even more advanced aircraft. In fact, they had been developing their ideas as early as 1933, and their concept was for a low-wing monoplane that had a retractable undercarriage, full cockpit canopy, powerful water-cooled engine, and a mixed armament of cannon and machine guns. Again, the project was essentially a private development between the two men, but in 1935 they were joined by Slobodan Zrnić, head of production at the Yugoslavian State Aircraft Factory. In 1936, the three men were confident enough to present their designs to the Royal Yugoslavian Air Force and the authorities for consideration. Here, they hit some scepticism. The previous IK-2 was still undergoing testing and being examined by the Yugoslavians for potential service. To be suddenly presented with an aircraft that seemed to be right on the cutting edge, when they were still working on ironing out the kinks on the previous aircraft, created reservations about the new design. But by this point, other nations were actively adopting aircraft of this type, and after the initial hesitation, the Yugoslavian government signed a contract to build a prototype in late March 1937. Production was allocated to the Rogožarski factory in Belgrade, and by April 1938, this aircraft, the first IKZ, was completed. Now, I should address the issue of the IKZ, IK-3 naming convention, because in many texts the aircraft is referred to as the IK-3. It seems that the original intention was to call it the IKZ, drawing an initial from each of the designers' names. But in the Cyrillic alphabet, Z looks very much like the numeral 3, and so, especially as there had already existed the previous IK-1 and 2, somewhere some confusion has crept in, and the aircraft is often called as a result the IK-3. Anyway, the IKZ was a thoroughly modern aircraft that showed its French influences very strongly. The aircraft was powered by a Hispano-Suiza 12YV12 engine, which in the prototype was purchased from France, but in the production models was a variant licensed built by the Czech Avia company and which produced 920 horsepower. The fuselage was of mixed construction, with a steel tube superstructure and the aircraft skin being both metal and fabric. The wing was made of wood, with some steel internal structure parts. In appearance, the IKZ looked very similar to contemporary French fighters, such as the MS-406. Probably not surprising, as the designers had received their technical training in that country, and the armament also followed the French pattern. The prototype was armed with an HS-9 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub, and two Dahn machine guns of .303 caliber mounted in the fuselage. Flight testing began in May 1938 and showed that the aircraft was a very good performer. The controls were very responsive, and the aircraft proved itself to be remarkably agile, with principal complaints being with the canopy design, which caused distortion, and some issues with engine heating. The only other real issue was with the armament, which was favourably commented on for its concentrated fire, but was thought to be a little lightweight, and the test pilots suggested that consideration be given to adding additional machine guns in the wings. But generally, the reviews were extremely positive. Most of the test pilots had experience flying a range of types, from the Fury biplane then in service with the Royal Yugoslavian Air Force, to many foreign designs that had been assessed for potential purchase, including the Hawker Hurricane, the Heinkel HE-112, and the French MS-405. They reported that the IKZ was a match for all of these, and better in some regards. The successful test program and praise from the pilots meant that the Royal Yugoslavian Air Force was happy to take the new design into service, and in November 1938 an order was placed for 12 production aircraft. Tragedy then struck the following January when the prototype was lost during a flight. During a dive test, the windscreen tore loose, causing the pilot to try to pull up too hard, which in turn tore the starboard wing off, causing the aircraft to crash and killing the test pilot. This caused a delay while further examinations of the design were conducted, but the aircraft was still recognised as a fine potential fighter. Plus, the Royal Yugoslavian Air Force was now trying to build up its strength as the tensions in Europe rushed towards breaking point. So production continued, but unfortunately the reliance on certain components from foreign suppliers also became an issue, as well as strikes at the aircraft factory, and so the 12 production aircraft would only be delivered gradually between December 1939 and July 1940. These aircraft were equipped with a 20mm Oerlikon FFM cannon and two 7.92mm FN Browning machine guns in the nose. But production issues aside, the IK-3 did seem to be a formidable fighter. In the pre-service tests that the Royal Yugoslavian Air Force conducted, the top speed of the aircraft was recorded as 327 miles per hour, and the IKZ would be considered a match for both the Hawker Hurricane, which the Yugoslavs were building under licence, and the Bf-109E, 73 of which were by this point in service with the RYAF and represented its most formidable fighter. Against the Bf-109, the IKZ was found to be more agile in level flight, being able to outturn the Messerschmitt, and it was hoped that more could be wrung out of the design. The 7th aircraft on the production line was retained to have modifications, with improvements being made to the aerodynamic design and canopy, a more powerful version of the engine, armour being fitted for the pilot, and self-sealing tanks. These changes do appear to have indeed improved performance, with the testing showing that the aircraft was capable of 340 miles per hour. But though the Yugoslavians wanted as many aircraft as they could get, the issues of obtaining parts from foreign suppliers, as war had now broken out, was recognised as a significant issue. So only 25 of the improved IKZs were ordered in March 1940, this being thought the maximum that it would be possible to build with the parts available. Indeed, the concerns over the supply of engines led to work being conducted to examine the possibility of fitting either Rolls-Royce Merlin or Daimler-Benz DB601 engines to the IKZ. Nothing came of this because the clock was ticking for Yugoslavia, and on the 6th of April 1941, the Germans and their allies attacked. On the Yugoslavian Air Force's strength were 11 IKZs, with one of the production aircraft having been lost in an accident in 1940. But of the remaining aircraft, only 6 were available for combat, and they were thrown into the maelstrom from the very beginning. Defending Belgrade, 5 of the IKZs attacked the first German air raid on the city, a force comprising of 234 bombers and 120 fighters. Needless to say, against these sorts of odds, losses were heavy, and by the end of the first day, only 3 of these aircraft were still operational. But the IKZ pilots were credited with 8 kills. The IKZs continued to fight, with desperate attempts made to get the damaged or non-operational aircraft available for use, including the improved variant prototype. But continuous action in trying to repel the assault meant that often only 3 of the aircraft were ever available at any one time. By the evening of the 11th of April, German troops were close to the airfield that the operational IKZs were based at, and, with the end in sight, on the morning of the 12th, the crews burnt their aircraft to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. With the fall of Yugoslavia a few days later, 2 IKZs were apparently captured by the Germans, probably aircraft under repair at the factory, and were reportedly used for flight testing. But ultimately they too were scrapped, and that was the end of the IKZ. However, they did leave a legacy. Though heavily outnumbered, the IKZs were credited with shooting down 11 enemy aircraft, an impressive feat considering the opposition they faced. But additionally, after the war, the design team were able to dust off their plans and incorporate new ideas into the design to produce a new fighter, the S-49, which would go on also to serve the Yugoslavian Air Force, though this time in somewhat larger numbers.